Welcome to this lesson on Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark, and we'll be looking at Galatians chapter 4, and we'll be starting at verse 23, 24, somewhere in there. But before we begin, our theme verse for Lunch with the Lord, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and rejoicing of my heart. Now, last lesson we did start touching on verses 22, 23, and we'll just cover them quickly now, and then we'll get into verse 24. He says here, For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by the bondmaid, the other by a free woman, but he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise. Now verse 24, which things are an allegory, for these are the two covenants, the one from the Mount Sinai, which genders to bondage, which is Agar, for this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. Now, as we said in last lesson, that in verses 22 through 25, Paul is contrasting these two sons of Abraham, Ishmael and Isaac. And Paul is going to use these two sons as a picture of people's relationships to God, either by the law or by grace. And in verse 24, he says, which things are an allegory, for these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which genders to bondage, which is Agar. Paul is emphasizing that the law, which originated on Mount Sinai, leads to bondage and is represented by the bondwoman and anything that she produces, okay? Isaac was born of the free woman, and it's represented by Jerusalem, which is from above, and is given by the grace of God. So he says here that Isaac and Ishmael are an allegory for these two covenants, okay? The one covenant of grace and the covenant of law, and he's using Isaac and Ishmael to represent these two covenants. And he says the one was from Mount Sinai. This is Ishmael, which genders to bondage, which is Agar. So Agar, which is Hagar, produces, she is a bondslave of Abraham. And anything she produces is also in bondage, okay? And she represents the covenant of the law. But Isaac, who was from the free woman, from Sarah, whatever she produces comes from, is freedom, okay? Now, verse 25, for this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. It says here that Hagar was a slave, and any children that she produced would also become slaves. And it's only fitting that Hagar would come to represent Mount Sinai, where the law was given to Moses. So Hagar of the Old Testament represents Mount Sinai, which leads to bondage. Why? Because the law was given on Mount Sinai, and the law leads to bondage. Well, Hagar was a bondwoman, and she was Abraham's and Sarah's slave, and therefore she represents bondage, and whatever she produces is in bondage also. Now, if you turn to Genesis chapter 21, after Sarah kicked out Hagar and her son, we see that in verse 21. So in Genesis chapter 21, verse 21, it says that Hagar and Ishmael went to live in the wilderness of Paran. Now, why is that important? Because there was something also in the wilderness of Paran. It was Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is in the wilderness of Paran. And it just seems interesting that when Hagar and Ishmael were kicked out of Abraham's house by Sarah, they went to live in the wilderness of Paran, right where Mount Sinai was. So the law, like bondage, is going to bondage. And Hagar is a picture of the Galatian believers who leave the promised land and they go with their children to live in the land of bondage. And this is what happens this is what is happening with the Galatian believers. They were brought up, they were saved, and it was like them being brought up in Abraham's house, in freedom. And but now they leave the promised land, they leave the promises of God in order to go live in bondage. Hagar, while she was living with Abraham and Sarah, even though she was like she was still living in a house that represented freedom and liberty. But she herself was a slave, yes, but she was in the house of liberty and the house of freedom. But when she left, she went and she lived in a land of bondage where the law was given in Mount Sinai, in the wilderness of Paran. So she leaves the promises and goes to live in the bondage. And this is what the Galatians were doing. They were rejecting the promises and the freedom and the liberty that was given to them by grace through faith in Christ, and they were going to live in the land of bondage, to live under the law. And Hagar, the woman of bondage, will always be associated with Sinai, the place of bondage. So here you have the woman of bondage will always be associated with the place of bondage. And it says here in verse 25, "For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children." It says, "and answers to Jerusalem, which now is," meaning this Jerusalem that's spoken of in verse 25 is the earthly Jerusalem. Okay? The Jerusalem spoken of in verse 26 is the heavenly Jerusalem. So verse 25 is speaking about the earthly Jerusalem. Verse 26 is speaking about the heavenly Jerusalem. The Jerusalem of Paul's day, the earthly Jerusalem, was under the same bondage, trying to keep a law that could not be kept in order to attain an acceptance with God that they could not attain. So they're trying to keep a law they can't keep to attain something they can't attain. But in reality, they already had what they were trying to attain. They just were ignoring it. They were being deceived and led astray by the Judaizers, and they believed the Judaizers' message to try to attain righteousness through keeping the law. And all the children that this Jerusalem produces are in the same bondage. So it says here, "For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia," and answers to what? And answers to Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that now is, the earthly Jerusalem that now is, and is in bondage with her children. So not only Hagar and the wilderness of Paran, but also this earthly Jerusalem, they're all in bondage. because they're all trying to live under the law. They're all trying to live by the law. And then verse 26 says, but Jerusalem, now this is the heavenly Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. And as Sarah represents promise, grace, and freedom, so Jerusalem, the Jerusalem from above, is also by promise, grace, and it's free. Okay? So, in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 22, it says, but we are come unto Mount Zion, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. What? The heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels. So Paul here is saying that, but the Jerusalem which is above is free. Don't live in the Jerusalem from below. Now they were Galatians, that's true. They lived in the land, the land of Galatia. But when the Judaizers came, I'm sure they were speaking a lot about what was going on in Jerusalem. That Jerusalem would be the hub of their life now, because now they're starting to live by the law. And what better example do we have of living by the law than by the people who live in Jerusalem, right? So, saying don't live by this Jerusalem, because the earthly Jerusalem is in bondage, just like Hagar, just like the Mount Sinai represents bondage. The earthly Jerusalem, that one over there in the land of Israel, that Jerusalem, it's in bondage because it's desiring to live and to seek acceptance from God by the law. But he's saying you live not by the earthly Jerusalem, but by the heavenly Jerusalem, because that Jerusalem is free, okay? Which is the mother of us all, just like Sarah. Sarah represented promise. She got a promise from God. She represented grace, because it was the grace of God that caused her to be able to be pregnant, right? And freedom. She was free. She wasn't a slave to Abraham. She wasn't a slave to anybody. She had a slave, Hagar, but she wasn't a slave. And this is what our heavenly Jerusalem is. Same thing. It comes by promise. You can become a member of the heavenly Jerusalem because you accepted Christ into your heart, and God promises to you. This heavenly Jerusalem is by a promise, not by bondage, not by law. It's by grace, not through the law, and it's free. Okay? The heavenly Jerusalem is not a Jerusalem of bondage and of works. No. It's a Jerusalem of freedom. And that's the Jerusalem that we are members of. Okay? And that's the Jerusalem that we live by and that we seek for. The heavenly Jerusalem. All right? Until next lesson, walk with the Lord. I know He walks with you.